German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says he wants a more balanced relationship with China. After holding talks with Chinese Premier Li Chiang here in Berlin, the Chancellor stressed the importance of engaging with Beijing. We have more now on Germany's Chinese Balancing Act.
It was a visit marked by symbolism. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz welcomed China's Premier Li Chiang and his delegation with military honors. This suggests that Scholz still wants to stay friendly with China, Germany's most important trading partner. Scholz acknowledged that Germany needs to diversify its economic partnerships in Asia and emphasized the importance of good communication with Beijing.
Let us continue the dialogue to understand each other well and to be able to face the global challenges together.
Berlin is keen to stress whether two sides can work together, signing an agreement to set up work together on climate change. Scholz only briefly touched on tensions in the relationship. He called on China to pressure Russia to end the war in Ukraine, saying it must not become a frozen conflict. But Li dodged this altogether, focusing on strengthening economic ties.
The global economic recovery lacks momentum. As two influential major countries in the world, China and Germany should cooperate more closely to make more contributions to world peace and development.
One irony didn't escape the assembled journalists. Scholz called on China to provide access for foreign media.
Journalism also needs free space and openness. German correspondents want to report from China. They need access to do so. We are advocating for that.
But that openness has limits even in Berlin. The news conference ended after the two leaders' statements with no questions taken.
Well, I'm joined here now at the big table by journalist Finn Meyer-Kuckuck from China Table, which provides expert analysis on issues regarding China for policymakers. Finn, it's good to have you with us here. How should we see this visit coming as it does after U.S. Secretary of State Blinken's visit with Xi Jinping in Beijing earlier this week?
There's a tendency to mend the ties with China that were really broken, especially after the Russian invasion into Ukraine. The Western countries were aghast that China is still supporting Russia. But on the other hand, people got sort of used to the Ukraine situation. And now it seems it's time to reestablish ties. And so both events, Antony Blinken's visit and Li Chiang's visit, fall into the same pattern.
We know that relations with China, they weren't helped by what we experienced with the pandemic. And now we've got the war in Ukraine complicating things further. Where is Germany's relationship with China headed?
The general tendency is to get a bit tougher on China, but especially Chancellor Scholz is very far from becoming a falcon. He knows that Germany is extremely dependent on China, and the dependency is not getting less, it's getting more. Recent data, for example, trade in 2022 was even higher, and new data that came out today showed that even more electronic components than ever before came from China to Germany, and he knows that. And he also knows that a lot of the earnings of German companies, big and small, depend on China. So there's a general tendency to get tougher on China, but at the same time, the Chancellor is standing on the brake because he wants good economic ties with China.
Is he dealing with a reality that was created by 20 years of Angela Merkel?
Yes. The 20 years of Angela Merkel, and by the way, himself, because he for a very long time was part of that government as well. Angela Merkel did not see it coming. She didn't see it coming with Russia, and she didn't see it coming with China. And
those are two big things not to see.
Yeah, these are huge things not to see. But on the other hand, many people also didn't see it, and as long as it worked beautifully. And also the relations with China. The actual risk, as long as trade relations are normal, are not so high. They are manageable. What we are looking at now is the Taiwan situation, a catastrophic change in relations that would make an embargo, maybe an all-out embargo against China necessary.
Well, let's take Taiwan out of the equation for a moment and just look at trade and foreign policy. How quickly can Germany realign itself vis-a-vis China?
Not quickly at all.
Yeah.
It took about, since the moment that China opened its markets, the Germans were there. Volkswagen was the first car maker to make one of these joint ventures with a Chinese state-owned company. Yeah. They have been in the country since the mid-80s. So it took like 40 years to create the economic entanglement between the two economies. And it will take decades to disentangle it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Germany has to, I guess, jump over its own shadow here. And I'm wondering, how much is it caught in between the European Union trying to set its new China policy and also following policy that is being directed by the United States?
The United States wants something entirely different at the moment. They want to reassert their position as the #1 global power. This is an agenda that Europe and Germany don't share per se.
But they both say that China is a systemic rival, right?
It is. And in the end, of course, Germany and the EU play in Team USA. If there's a choice, if there will be a hard choice between these two, of course, it's not Team China with the lack of freedom and all the atrocities on the human rights front that happened there, but it is the USA.
So do you think Germany will be able to remain economically entwined with China like it is now, as long as it has a signal from the U.S. that the U.S. has its back no matter what? I mean, it's like a security umbrella that we've known now for 70 years.
The big question is if this signal will always be there. Joe Biden is sort of an old school politician in this respect. Yeah. He's very friendly to the Europeans. He's saving us now in the Ukraine situation by giving so much support to Ukraine that Russia can't win, at least not short term. And still he is asserting his position against China. But a future US administration might handle this entirely differently. And then Europe is in deep trouble because Europe can't defend itself.
Yeah, and there's a presidential election in the US next year. I mean, things could change abruptly then, or let's say 5-6 years that change could come. I mean, does Germany, do you think that its leaders see the need to prepare themselves for these realignments that are taking place?
The realignments economically will never come early enough to react to the new administration. Also, there are different views in the coalition in Germany. The Greens and the Liberal Democrats want faster change. The SPD
a values-based foreign policy, yeah?
Yes. But the Chancellor wants it a bit slower, it seems. Also, this was part of the message of today's visit in Berlin.
Finn, it's good to have you here. We appreciate you coming in to the studio to talk with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the visit of the Chinese Prime Minister to Berlin comes just after U.S. Secretary of State Blinken met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. Now, these meetings suggest a Chinese willingness to re-engage with the West to help take the edge off of tensions. But apart from cordial comments, there was very little for the U.S. Secretary of State to show from his talks in China. China still is not sending weapons to Russia to help it fight its war in Ukraine, but there's no sign of the U.S. managing to open a gap between Beijing and Moscow. And while the U.S. leads Western efforts to isolate the Russian economy as punishment for the invasion of Ukraine, Beijing announced today that its imports of Russian oil are at their highest level since the war began. Dmitry Aperovich is a political analyst focusing on geopolitics and cybersecurity. He joins me now from Washington. Dmitry, it's good to see you again. So how successful can the isolation of the Russian economy be? I mean, Beijing is not sending weapons to Russia, but it is buying more and more oil, isn't it?
China is really a critical node in the strategy. And so far, of course, they have been unwilling to play ball and try to isolate Russia. In fact, one of the things that China is doing is not just buying energy from Russia, certainly supplying money to the Russian government coffers, but also shipping lots of its critical goods to Russia. And while it's not supplying military weapons themselves, certainly a lot of the precursors and materials that are needed to build those weapons are being supplied. And one of the things it's doing is allowing transshipments of Western goods, particularly semiconductors, to also flow to Russia.
U.S. diplomacy is going to strike out in another direction this week with the visit of India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. India, it's also a keen customer for Russian oil. Can Washington expect any good news coming from Mr. Modi?
I don't think that we're going to get good news on that Russian front from Mr. Modi, because certainly India is very keen on continuing to purchase Russian gas and Russian oil at relatively cheap prices. That's good for its economy. It's not going to sacrifice that in the interest of isolating Russia. But I think the key conversation between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi is going to be on China. That's where the interests of India and U.S. are much more aligned. Both countries, of course, are in a competition with China. India has a border dispute with China and is increasingly concerned about China's influence in the region. And that's where we can see some progress.
The economic power of the West, led by the United States, when you look at that, do you see it being diminished now by the rise of China and India? We're seeing in their dealings with Russia, if they don't get on board with the U.S. and sanctions, it can make these sanctions basically toothless.
Well, the reality is that sanctions have very rarely actually transformed countries. South Africa and the apartheid regime in the 1980s is probably the one example of sanctions being successful. But when you look at our sanctions policy vis-a-vis North Korea or Iran or even Iraq during Saddam era, none of them have accomplished the objective of what we wanted to see, of curtailing their weapons programs in the case of Iran or North Korea, or changing the regime in Iraq. So it's very, very difficult for the United States. It's always been difficult to use sanctions to really transform these countries. And of course, one only has to look at the embargo on Cuba that's been going on for 70 years and still has not had a successful regime change in our own backyard and here in the Caribbean.
Yeah, U.S. lawmakers, they are quick to talk about a link between the Ukraine war and the situation with Taiwan. There's a suggestion that Beijing is watching the Western response before making its own calculation over Taiwan. Is it really so clear-cut? What do you think?
I'm not convinced by those arguments. Certainly, President Xi is watching very carefully, particularly the economic sanctions that the U.S. and its allies have put on Russia, and certainly it's thinking about what it can do to minimize the impact of those types of sanctions in the future on the Chinese economy should it decide to invade Taiwan. But I don't think it's going to look at the success or failure of this invasion of Ukraine by Russia as a determining factor for whether it should invade Taiwan. Those are two very different situations. One would be an amphibious naval assault on the island. Another is mostly a land-based campaign. And of course, China has had aspirations to take over Taiwan for many, many decades, going back to Mao's time in the 1950s. And it is not contingent on whether Russia is able to accomplish its objectives in Ukraine. So the argument that's often being made in Washington and parts of Europe is that if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, China will definitely invade Taiwan. I don't think that's the case. But also the reverse is not true, that if Russia fails in Ukraine, it will not necessarily deter Xi from invading Taiwan.
There are similarities that you have to admit, right? That when we're talking about the war in Ukraine and the situation with Taiwan, if someone poses the question, how will this end? No one can give you a clear answer, either with Ukraine or with Taiwan.
Well, with Taiwan, the goal of U.S. policy really since 1979 with our one China ambiguous policy is to kick the ball down the road, right? To make sure that this issue does not get resolved in our lifetime, and really to make sure that President Xi or whoever is the leader in China wakes up every single morning and says, today is not the day when I'm going to do this. I cannot do this today. And in hopes that ultimately there will be a change of government in China, perhaps, where they're going to give up on this idea that Taiwan will get one day will become part of China. With Russia, it's very similar in the sense that how do we get President Putin or a successor, more likely, in Moscow to realize that Ukraine will never become part of Russia, and it needs to forget on those ambitions of rebuilding the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire of the 1800s and 1900s, and move on.
Let me ask you, before we run out of time, the U.S. Secretary of State said that he just could not convince China to at least commit to communications at senior military levels. And we've seen provocations from China. What should the U.S. do now? Should the U.S. respond in kind? I mean, should there be some mutual, silent treatment going on?
I don't think so. We don't want to get down to the Chinese level, but we need to realize that the reason that they're withholding those communications from us is because they believe that as long as we have a communication channel with the Chinese military, we would be more aggressive in our actions in the Indo-Pacific, and that that channel would serve almost like a seatbelt, allowing us to go faster, and that's why they're withholding it. So I don't think they're going to change their position anytime soon.
Political analyst Dmitry Alperovich. Dmitry, it's always good to get your take on things. Thank you.
Thank you so much.